So how shall we do this? I have a picture here of a tree. This is the tallest tree on the earth. Do you know how tall it is?
692 feet.
Meters?
That's too much, I think.
Is that in the tall trees grove in our redwood national forest?
I think that's too big. Yeah.
Too tall? Not that much though.
I think you're probably kind of doubled it or something.
No way. No way.
I think you added.
I said feet, not meters.
It's
8 meters.
8 meters?
16.
No.
147 feet.
What?
You're getting closer, but I think it's 300 and something. Let's ask Professor Google here. So, tallest
379.1.
tree in the world. Yeah, there you go.
How tall is it?
379.1.
Okay, well, so
Meters?
yeah,
Feet. Feet.
Oh.
tallest tree in the world. So,
115 meters.
well, that was a swamp gum. That's gone.
It fell.
Oh, yeah.
So, I think it's, anyway. So we know it's about 90 some meters high. 8, you said. So I think it says 379.7 here. What did you get? Is that the same?
It says here, research has confirmed that a 379.1 foot tree in Redwood National State Park is the world's tallest.
Right. Well, maybe it's growing because it's got another. Anyway, I think what's interesting about this is that when we look anywhere, we don't see, or in most places, we don't see this kind of height. And it's not just the height, it's the size of these trees and the age of these trees. And when you realize that below this tree, it's creating a canopy. Now that will be the tallest tree, but it's other trees which are around there. So that means that the canopy is going to be up there at 70, 80 meters. And now we have areas which don't even have a canopy. And when we do have a closed canopy, it's all these miniature trees that were planted 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Now, what I study is ecosystem function. Now, that's not just about the trees then. It's about what are the processes which are happening because these trees are standing there. So they're all respirating. They're all absorbing carbon. They're all absorbing water. And so what's happening below this canopy, and in the canopy, and in the diversity that's built up there, this is the functionality that has altered the planet and made it into paradise. So if we cut that down, then we will never see this again in our lifetimes, because these trees are over 1,000 years old. So we will live for a few decades, but we will not be able to do this. So we need to protect all of the last remaining of these, but we also need to start a development trajectory which returns those. So in 1,000 years from now, instead of in a few little places you have this, the earth again is restored to functionality, because this is what regulates the climate. We're not going to build a machine to do this. It's ridiculous. We're not going to color the sky or throw iron filings into the oceans and get a good result. We can try those things, but it's going to end up badly in the way that a lot of other things have gone wrong. So I just was interested in that, because it always struck me that when I go to the most beautiful places, the canopy will be enormous. There'll be all sorts of epiphytes hanging off. The place will be moist. It'll be cool. The temperatures are completely different. We're talking about 2 to 6 degree temperature differentials in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You can find 10 to 20 degrees centigrade differences between below a vegetated canopy and on exposed soils. Now, what does that tell you? We're not using this information. We have to go out and we have to tell, because the reason that we're not using this information is it doesn't suggest that corporate business as usual, buying and selling things as the basis of global society, will work. It suggests that something else is more important and more valuable. So the makers of cell phones, and they hurt us. We've got to be afraid. Be very afraid. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say. And now I want to answer questions. What's on your mind? What should we talk about? Who wants to go first? Alex.
How are you supposed to do anything about that? Like, our entire life is based off of this corporate structure. Like,
No, it's not.
I mean, when you look out the window and you look out there, you see the trees, and then you see all these buildings, right? I think that's all done by money. You know, how are you supposed to forget that and say, well, we have to turn back to the environment, and that's what we have to do to save this planet?
Well, I think that within your statement is an assumption. And that assumption has to do with money. Now, I actually think money is a pretty useful tool. So the question is not so much about money, it's about what is money based on. The question I would get to, if you just cut, since we have just a few minutes together, what is money? What is it? Yeah.
A derivative of natural resources?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that's true. I would say the products that are made and traded, those are derivatives. And what we're saying is that money is based on these derivatives because of the GDP, the gross domestic product. So if you look and you think about this, but now, what is the evidence that money should be based on these derivatives? Where does it come from? So this is all historical. So we didn't do this, but we inherited it. We have it now. And we need to analyze it. Where did it come from? How does it work? Is it true? Now what I've seen is that ecosystem function is more valuable than the derivatives. So the products and services which we say are the basis of money are less valuable than that tree and the microclimate that's created below it, because that is creating oxygen and regulating the climate. And and this is what the indigenous peoples of the world have said for a long time. And it's an interesting thing, because maybe we better go to these indigenous people and say, excuse me, I think we may have gotten something wrong here, because we thought in the West and in China and in many other places that money was coming from manufacturing and buying and selling things. And there's not that much evidence. There's quite a lot of evidence that this creates huge deserts, that it does enrich some people, but it impoverishes many other people. And it causes huge destruction to the environment. So if we're worried about climate change, if we're worried about food security, if we're worried about these things, we better think, what is causing this? So we can recycle our plastic bottles, and we can try to reduce emissions, but I don't think that's going to make it. We need to realize what is going to determine the future. And what is going to determine the future is the same thing that determined the past. It's the total amounts and percentages of biomass and the total percentages of organic material and its biodiversity. This is how the earth emerged, and then we, human beings, emerged in paradise. And we started to say, hey, let's cut these things down. We don't know what that is. Let's cut it out, because I like the seed pod that has all these grains on it. That's the one I want. What are these other vegetation things? Let's cut those out, and we'll distribute the seeds, and you get two things at once: plowing and monocultures. Well, now who did that? Was it a professor of agronomy who thought that up? It was a Neanderthal with a sharpened stick. All of industrial agriculture is following a Neanderthal with a sharpened stick. And we better rethink about these things. And the economics is following a trajectory which comes from feudalism, slavery, imperialism, colonization, and mercantile expansion following the Industrial Revolution. Now, this is not a judgment. I'm not saying, oh, attack, revolt. No, I'm just saying, study history. This is what happened. This is not a judgment. It's the fact. And we need to admit the facts. The truth will set you free. So here we have a fact. Yes?
So I'm just looking, because I read a little bit, very little about the World Bank having this NCA, natural capital accounting.
Yes.
And I just wonder if that gives you any optimism, or is it a bunch of fluff, or?
Well, there's even a stronger one. I mean, natural capital accounting is one thing. There's a natural capital initiative in another place, and there's another study which is much larger, started by the United Nations, called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, TEEB. So this is probably, from ecological economics, the most developed of those studies. I don't agree with it either, because I think what you have here now is you have a fundamental problem. And if you think, like if you have a disease and the symptom is you're coughing, and you take cough syrup, it might not actually, it might ease the cough, but it might not really make you well. So if you treat the symptoms, the chances of getting well are not 100%. Now, I think if I look at this economic problem, that what the TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, is trying to do is trying to give a monetary value to what they call ecosystem services. Now, when you think about ecosystem services, we look at them, we look at this big tree, and we look at the canopy, we look at the soil, and we think, well, that's nice, it's fertile, and we have a microclimate. Those are all serving us.
Okay.
Those are ecosystem services. They're not there to serve us. They're part of ecological function. That's how the Earth systems function for all life. So in this way, you have to stop thinking that everything is on the Earth for human beings. You have to think that the human beings benefit, but they only benefit if the systems are functional. And that's true for all living things. And whether you think about this from a scientific perspective or even a religious perspective, or the perspective of that we are supposed to be good stewards of this, we need to understand this. How does this function? So the functionality is the basis of this, and the services are derivatives. What do we know about derivatives? If you value the derivatives higher than the source, you create a perverse incentive to degrade the source. We learned this in kindergarten. Does everybody know the story of the goose that laid the golden egg?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we eat the goose, no more golden eggs. And so the services that we get, they're derivatives. And what's happened now is our economy is a derivative-based economy. It should be based on the source of life. It's more valuable. And get ready for this, because it's bigger too. So we need growth. So now the idea is like, make bigger factories, produce more stuff, create more junk, fill up the landfills. That's growth, because it gives us jobs and we can buy and sell stuff. And that's going to be better for us, right? I don't think so. The real growth is here. We need to grow the canopy back the way it was before. We won't see it in our lifetime, but this is the great work of our time. Because if we don't do this, then future generations are going to have really serious problems. So, yes?
Okay, how do you deal with the growing population and the need for regrowing and reforesting and letting the canopy grow again? I mean, do you pile everyone into cities, and then how does that work? Because, I mean...
Yeah, I think what...
I mean, I'm humanitarian, but it does, I mean, it seems like humans are the cause of the problem. How do you deal with humans and the fact that we want... I mean, we're always talking about... I mean, I've seen a lot of projects about helping people, you know, stay alive and facilitating the lives of people. And it seems like that's part of the problem, that we enjoy these facilitated lives based on a derivative-based economy that, I mean, hard work is no longer valued much anymore, really.
Well, I think it's not up to an individual to decide what happens, first of all. So my opinion is not very important. It's not me who's going to decide what happens. I'm just a researcher who goes out and I look at things and I say, oh, you know, hey, in a natural forest, the canopy's 90 or 100 meters high. And in the rest of the world now, the canopy is miniaturized. Well, I wonder what effect that has. Well, I can do the calculations and the effect is clear. You reduce photosynthesis, you reduce organic buildup, accumulation of organic materials, and you massively reduce infiltration and retention of rainfall. This causes all the problems that we're having. It destroys the climate regulation, destroys the soil fertility and productivity that we need, and it massively alters the infiltration and retention of rainfall, which is the natural regulation of water, climate, weather. So when I look at the human population and this historical thing, I'd have to say, well, we're rising. The population is rising. But there's another trend which is taking place, because in developed countries, it's beginning to decrease.
But they see that as a bad thing, right? Zero population growth. And Europe's like, oh, you know, there are not going to be enough young people to pay, you know, for the social security of older people.
But our task is not to look for all the reasons why things won't work. Our task is to look for a way forward that can lead to sustainability, I would say. So we could like say, well, why aren't we going to be able to survive? Well, I can tell you lots and lots of reasons why it's going to be bad. But I don't think that's very useful. I think what's most important is to see what it's like on the other side of a paradigm. So if you look at this in one way, change is inevitable. Change is going to happen. I went overseas to cover the Cold War, and the Cold War ended. So the Soviet Union collapsed, and it's gone. And so nobody talks about Brezhnev. You talked about Brezhnev lately? You know, even Gorbachev is, you know, he's still alive. So, you know, really, change is inevitable. It's coming. The question is, what changes are we going to have? Are we going to control it? Or are the changes going to be caused by massive catastrophes? So if you look at the television set now, then you'll see the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. And you'll even see that young people, mainly young adolescent males and post-adolescent males, are attracted to this. They're going there from England and Belgium and the Netherlands and the USA and Canada to join these people. And sadly, I think they're going to lose their lives, because the reaction to this is that the US government and other governments are bombing them, and they're bringing soldiers and guns and planes, and there's no real thought. Both sides of this seem insane to me. Is this the end of civilization? Now that's in the Middle East right now. If that's not going to change, it could grow. That conflict is longer than any other contemporary war that we've had in the 20th century. That's astonishing, and it's terrifying. Yeah?
What do you think are some solutions for the war that's going on in the Middle East right now?
I think we have to have another option. I would say, like everybody I have seen at the Gen conference and in the Gen community that I've been to in different parts of the world, they're all thinking, like, how can we deal with these problems? They're really thinking in a beautiful way. They want to take care of children. They want to make sure there's food. They want to end poverty. They want to end climate change or end human impacts on climate change. How do you do those kinds of things? So, but they want to. They have the impulse. What I realized in the Middle East is very few people who have that kind of thinking are acting in that space. The people who are acting in that space are these crazies who are going out and doing terrible things, or a heavily violent response to kill them. And by the way, destroy all the infrastructure and everything is ruined. It's just level it. Well, you know, that doesn't seem like a good idea actually to me, because a lot of the people that are getting hurt, all these refugees, they're just completely innocent. They're fleeing, like, how do I get out of here? Because on that side are crazies, and then, you know, then we're being bombed by the other people, so they're just running. So all of those people are suffering. They're innocent victims. And there's more of them than anything else. I think you can actually calculate the numbers of the Islamic State militants. And, well, there's quite a lot of firepower on the military side coming at them. But the most of the victims are there in the middle, the people who have nothing to do with it, children, women, people fleeing, old people who are running away. So I just thought about it myself. I thought a few weeks ago, am I doing anything about that? And no. I'm actually turning off the TV and not reading the newspaper because I don't want to know anymore. Because it's so horrible that, and I think there's nothing I can do. And then I thought, is there something that we could do? And I think we could. We could restore the Middle East. If we restored the Middle East to ecological function, it would take a lot of people. It would take a lot of work. But you know, it's doable. The funny thing is, it's possible. We know if you go into your garden and you've got no soil at all, and you work hard and you bring organic materials and manures and you create compost and you grow, you can have great soil there. Yeah.
Well, I remember when I lived in Qatar, which is near Saudi Arabia, we had gone to vacation and we were there for a while, and when we went to vacation to another place where there was so much green, we couldn't believe it. After after a year of not seeing trees and stuff, it's incredible.
Yes. Well, there are places with very low rainfall, and it's going to be very difficult to deal with that. But in certain places, you can deal with it. One of the places is Jordan, and it used to be beautiful. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to your views on the monetary system.
Yes.
It resonates a lot with what, I don't know if you're familiar with Jacques Fresco and his idea of the resource-based economy. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
That's the guy in Florida?
Yeah.
I've heard
what
about
are your
him.
views on that? Because some dismiss it as a utopian idea, and others say it's feasible. So I want to, and your ideas resonate with what he said, so I wanted to know your views.
Well, I think it is a bit utopian. But I don't mind that. You know, Hollywood is actually spreading enough dystopia for everybody. So you have these polar things, and you know, mainly Hollywood is telling you that the future is going to be zombies, and it's going to be heavily armed people killing each other in a post-apocalyptic landscape. That's the Hollywood imagination. We need another vision.
So his idea is an economy functioning without the monetary system. Is that what you are advocating, or?
Well, I think money works pretty well. So I'm not sure I'd throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Because we need a means of exchange, we need a storehouse of value, and we need a trust mechanism that is helping civilization to work. So if we throw out money, I mean, I tell you that in my lifetime I've seen it. They threw out money in Cambodia, and they called it Kampuchea, and they put in a repressive regime, and there was a terrible genocide. Millions of people were killed, and it was horrible. So I'm not sure that throwing out money is the right idea. I wouldn't do anything without considerable collective thought, whatever it is. Yeah.
Just listening to the different perspectives here, I think mixing with my own conversations I've had with students and thoughts of my own, it's really easy to feel, to fall into a situation of feeling pretty hopeless about the future. It's really easy. But if you look at, if you forget for a minute, you know, what system are we operating under, what are the economic, what are those force, how the economics force has to behave in certain ways. You know, I'm sure we've all heard the criticism of some, if you speak out against using fossil fuels, then someone might say to you, oh, well, look at you driving, you know, that kind of turning the focus back on you and implying, not just implying, stating your hypocrisy. And that's, you know, it's really a terrible argument to make back to someone. I'm trying to make things better, and you're saying, hey, you know, like your parents or the mafia, and you say you shouldn't be in the mafia. There shouldn't be a mafia. Well, you benefit every day from it. So it's like, well, it doesn't matter. We still shouldn't have it. So, but I think what triggered me to talk right now is this conversation about money and barter. You know, there's places in the United States where communities have turned to like a barter system to do certain things, and so. But I think it's easy. You wouldn't want to say, oh, that's the way we should do things. I think that the power of those kind of systems are people coming together in small groups and larger groups, but small groups and deciding we're going to do something differently, and then do it. And we're all here right now presenting things that you all have done to make the world a better place in your small corner of it. And that's the only way, that's the only control we have. I mean, all the problems we look out in the world right now are the collective actions of billions and billions and billions of people. And they haven't all made the world bad. But overall, many things have been bad because of it. We can't change that. But what we can change is the collective act, or the individual actions you all have. And the idea is that those individual actions, people look at and say, oh, I want to do that too. And maybe some collective actions to make things better. And that's the only way you're going to find hope. So, and then at the same time, people should be looking at the economy. How do we look at philosophy, and how do we look at economics, and how do we study at school, and then come up with ideas? Because at the end of the day, it's what you do and what the leadership that you exercise, and people follow what you do.
Alex?
Well, what I find scary is that even I mean, like, all these ideas make sense, and the power of corporations today is that, like, no one at the top who controls our society is, like, willing to do this because all they want is money. And they're like, when you think about it, like, I live in Washington D.C. and, like, the power of corporations it's everywhere. It's in our government even if we don't see it, like, there. And I like, when I watch the news, I don't see, like, any hope that these corporations are going to turn around and say, well, maybe we should stop.
Yeah, I think this idea is that what we do is really what it's about. So if I look at the situation, I would say that some of the worldview that we've inherited is corrupt and corrupting. And if we don't look at it critically, then we're definitely doing it. We're joining that thing. And if we do look at it critically, then we have to think, well, what can we possibly do? You know, how do we get out of it? How do we change it? So what I think is that inside corporations, you can't even say that corporations are bad. There's a really big movement now called B Corps, benefit corporations. So corporations which are incorporating, and they're writing new articles of association, and they're saying, we're not here to create just a return on investment. We're here to create a huge benefit for the society. And if you look at all the things, what have we done? Look at the size of the infrastructure to make a school for you. Look at the infrastructure in a city. Look at the infrastructure in the airports or in all these other things. It's pretty enormous to do this kind of thing. You're probably not going to do those things, the great things, as a hobby. You're going to need some professional engineers and technicians and skilled people to do these things. But I would say that there's a whole nother level too, because, like, look at these tables. So now we don't have any craftsmen anymore who make things which are unique and beautiful. So all the things that you get are manufactured. And, like, small craftsmen have been driven out of business in order for giant factories and corporations to do this kind of thing. This all could change. This all could change. And within the corporations as well, besides benefit corporations, within corporations, all the people in the corporations are people. They have children. They, you know, there was two Nobel Prizes. One was John Nash. If you ever see this movie, A Beautiful Life, I think it's called A Beautiful Life. A Beautiful Mind. A Beautiful Mind, exactly. He got the Nobel Prize. He was schizophrenic, and it's tough, but he was also a great mathematician. He is a great mathematician. And Eleanor Ostrom got a Nobel Prize for her work. And both of these, of this work, is looking at what happens when you pursue individual interest to the point that it erodes the collective interest. So if you pursue individual interest to the point it erodes the collective interest, it's not in your interest anymore, because you're going to be destroyed by other forces, because you took too much. And I think we have to look at this and we have to say, well, that's kind of interesting. So we see this, like, look at Rome, or look at the Lus Plateau, the ancient Chinese, or you look at all these other things. And all the ancient civilizations, they collapsed and their civilizations failed. And so globally, we're at this thing where we're seeing the atmosphere, the oceans, the climate, the freshwater systems, the biodiversity. What do you think those are indicating? those are indicating systemic dysfunction on a planetary scale. So that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to take care of this. That means you really need to consider what's going on. Yeah, please.
I've seen your work at a couple of gin conferences, and I know that the solutions exist, although not everyone utilizes them. So in the examples that you have shown, like the lowest plateau in China, what were the preconditions for getting the people invested and the government on board and actually putting money towards that purpose of turning degraded land into something that's ecologically functional again?
Good question. The initial reason for the restoration, well, I mean, there were many reasons, but one was that they felt that as a socialist country, they couldn't have wealth growing in the East Coast and have poor people out in some weird, giant, degraded state. So they thought that they had a moral responsibility to do something. That was the initial thought. The second one was that the sediments which went into the river were so damaging because the rivers would flood. And then after the flood, there would be a drought because the water didn't infiltrate, so it couldn't be used in agriculture. So they had a cycle of flooding and drought. And they calculated, this is called econometrics, useful, very useful. They calculated the cost of every year dredging the river for the huge amounts of sediments that went in. And they found that that cost was very high. And then they calculated the cost of doing restoration on a big scale, and it was less. So if it's less expensive to do restoration than it is to annually mitigate, it's actually free to do the restoration. And this is actually, I think, the final thing, if you follow, is this is the truth. Because the results, it depends on how you calculate, however. Because if you calculate simply in a GDP economic way, it may not be as valuable in that way. But if you calculate from carbon sequestration, you calculate from hydrological regulation, you calculate from social capital from jobs, you calculate from biodiversity, it's free. You know, the value is enormous. In fact, we cannot actually capture the value in the GDP economy. Yeah.
So you mentioned the main reason that China did this was because they were a socialist government and they felt responsible to do it. So how do you incentivize now capitalistic?
Well, you have
government.
You have humanism. I mean, you have morality. You have. I mean, we hold these rights to be. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Who said that? That's from the United States. Is that a capitalist idea or is that a socialist idea? You know, I think you have to look at this and you have to say, yeah, all people are equal. They were born, they're going to live for a little while, and they're going to die.
But as he mentioned earlier, you know, corporations within this system are very, very powerful, very manipulative, very able to deal and make larger incentives to the people who make policy, make law, right?
And according to my government, corporations are people.
Well, you know, I think we have to be somewhat realistic here. You know, most of you guys are in high school. I'm 61 years old and I research ecosystems. We're not going to be able to decide all the political things. But what's interesting is that if we act, we're going to have a result. If we don't act and we don't think, we're irrelevant to the outcome. That's basically what I've learned. So I wasn't thinking too much about all of these other issues. I was looking at whether the water could infiltrate into the soil and become fertile again in an area that looked like a desert. So when I found that, yeah, it can, then I started to think, well, why don't we do what we know from a scientific point of view is right? And then I found that the economics is against us to do that. So the economics creates a perverse incentive to maintain the status quo, which destroys the ecosystem. So we need to analyze this. We need to think: are we locked into this, or can we address fundamental things? Do we only treat the symptoms, or do we cure the disease?
But how do we balance the preserving of our ecosystems with manufacturing?
Well, I don't think preserving our ecosystems means that you don't have manufacturing. I think what it means is that you manufacture within a sustainable way. So, you know, if your ecosystems have value instead of being zero, then you have to do everything differently, because that's where the value is. Now, where are the poor people? So I was in Mali, and in Mali there are 14 million people in an area which is 1.2 million square kilometers. That's like the population of Los Angeles in an area twice the size of France. So they are according to the United Nations, they're among the poorest people on the earth. But they have this, the Niger River comes out of Guinea, and it floods up to 6 meters. You can't even see the other side. It's a huge freshwater inland sea. And then the river makes a big curve and goes into Nigeria, and every year it recedes, and every year it floods, and it recedes and it floods. And yet, so if I go there and I look at that, I go, well, what a phenomenon. I wonder what that's about. You know, what happens when water recedes and water, you know, at that scale, what happens? That's climate regulation. There are a few places on Earth, in Bangladesh, in the what's the swampy area in Florida, Everglades. You know, I mean, some of these places, they're enormously important. They're not just places that are, you know, filled with weird beings and interesting in funny documentaries that we go make. They are places which are functional. They produce oxygen. They produce biodiversity. They regulate the climate. And when you alter those systems, then you're going to get really, what happens when an area is deforested? So in a forested area, you have a completely different relative humidity. You'll go into that, and it's moist and it's cool. And when the trees are all cut down, what is it like? It's hot. And there's no respiration because the vegetation isn't there. So the density of the air is different. What happens to wind currents with dense air, and what happens to wind currents when there is no density? This is how you get enormous, erratic weather events. So if you start to see a lot of tornadoes, or a lot of hurricanes, or strange temperature fluctuations. I said before, below a tree canopy, it's not 2 to 6 degrees. It's 10 to 20 degrees difference between exposed soils and below a tree canopy. We need these natural systems, not because we think they're lovely, they are lovely, but because they're regulating the earth. They are the process which allow us to live.